Okay, everybody, good evening and welcome to Transportation Alternatives' 7th Annual Vision Zero Cities Conference. I'm very excited to see people tuning in from Guyana, Brazil, to Tampa, to Toronto, and look forward to seeing you in person next year. Since last year, a lot of good and a lot of bad has happened across the US. Even though driving is down, unfortunately, traffic deaths are up. And just here in New York City, traffic violence has killed more than 200 people in 2021 to date. The changes are in motion for a much better future. Also in New York, the city is systematically converting typical city streets into shared and open streets. In Berlin, advocates are pursuing the largest car-free zone proposal in the world. There is progress. This week, we're addressing ways experts, leaders, and activists work to make streets safe, livable, and equitable for people to get around. Together, we'll manage and prepare for good work ahead. I'm honored to present our keynote speaker, Charles T. Brown. Charles T. Brown is the founder and principal of Equitable Cities, a minority and veteran-owned urban planning, public policy, and research firm focused at the intersection of transportation, health, and equity. He's also an adjunct professor at the Bloustein School of Planning and Public Work at Rutgers, and has authored several groundbreaking studies that have redefined how experts analyze the role of race and racism in transportation and mobility. Please join me in welcoming Charles.
Thank you, Janet. First and foremost, thank you all for being here. I know you could have been anywhere else in the world today, but you decided to join us. For that, we thank you. Thank you to the host for having me here, Transportation Alternatives. Thank you to all of the people in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, just massive shout outs. No matter where you're coming from, thank you for being here today. Tonight, I want to talk about safe streets for all, the importance of centering racial equity in the national as well as international Vision Zero movement. I want to start by setting the record straight, however. I've been called Charlie Brown. I've been called many things, but what I prefer to be identified as or noted as is a street level researcher and a pracademic. I prefer those two things because number one, as a street level researcher, I know firsthand that many of the answers to the questions that we're asking are found in the streets among the people. I identify as a pracademic because I believe, secondly, that when it comes to the questions, research should be guided by the streets, not necessarily by the academic institutions of whom little of the research ends up benefiting in terms of the community itself. And so my research is grounded first in the values and the concerns of the community. And because of that, I believe in the importance of identifying as a street level researcher and as a pracademic, given my many years of experience inside and outside of academia. I was reared in a small town in Mississippi, a town of less than 500 people, and that town is Sugar Lock, Mississippi. We say 500 people, but the population swells to around 550 people when my family from Chicago, Milwaukee, and Detroit visits. So depending on when or not you visit Sugar Lock, you'll find that the population is anywhere between 500 and 550 people. And of course, my family there, they'll find it funny because they understand that in many ways that is true. But I share this slide with you because I'm coming right now from New Jersey. But the truth is the fact that I've lived, worked, and played in many cities across America, some green, some blue, some red, many though confused. But I understand, and because of these experiences, I feel like we are able to connect. So in the words of a great prophet from New York City, Jay-Z, I have 99 problems, but connecting with you isn't one of them. I live by the message that I am because we are. But what is equity? Equity is the presence of justice. Equity, is the guarantee of fair treatment access, opportunity, and advancement, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. The principle of equity acknowledges that there are historically underserved and underrepresented populations, and that fairness regarding these unbalanced conditions is needed to assist equality in the provision of effective opportunities to all groups. Equity then involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives. But equity is also, though, the presence of justice and fairness within the procedures, the processes, and most importantly, the distribution of resources by institutions or systems. But equity is more than a desktop exercise. Doing equity work requires an understanding of the underlying or root causes of inequalities and oppression within our society. And so then what is racial equity? Racial equity within the context of equity is about transforming the behaviors, the institutions, and the systems that disproportionately harm people of color. Increasing this access to power, redistributing and providing additional resources, and eliminating barriers to opportunity in order to empower low-income communities of color to thrive and reach full potential. It's about encouraging. Racial equity is not about excluding other marginalized groups, as equity impacts intersect and combine with other identities such as gender, sexual orientation, ability, and etc. But there are various dimensions of equity. It ranges from ability equity to vertical equity. But oftentimes what we normally hear is mostly about racial and ethnic equity and income equity or modal equity. But what about gender equity? What about language equity, outcome equity, process equity, and etc.? But it doesn't stop there. It also requires a consideration of social identities. So this equity work forces us to ask unique questions to ourselves, such as which identities do we think about most often? Which identities do we think about least often? Which of your own identities would you like to learn more about? And which of your identities have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself? And then lastly, which of your own identities have the greatest effect on how others perceive you? See, we ask these questions about identities because too often, those that you think about least often are too often left from the table when critical decisions are made about infrastructure, about policies and system and environmental changes in their communities. And to illustrate this point, I take you to one of my favorite places in the Northeast, the West Ward of Newark, New Jersey, where I had an opportunity to serve on the Urban League of Essex County, its board. And I use this photograph oftentimes in my presentations because it's the photograph that I use in my classes at Rutgers University with my graduate students. The first question I would ask many of them is, how would you change this photograph with this environment? And when I invite them to state what they would do, along with professionals around North America, most start with the following. What about sidewalk improvements? What about trees? What about benches? What about roadway improvements? Where is the bike lane? In short, they say everything except where are the people? And this work that we do, yes, it's about improving the built environment. Yes, it's about protecting the environment, but it's also about seeing people. Because when we're doing this work around the country and we don't take into consideration the people that are living there, when you engage with them about bicycle lanes and you hear or feel the pushback, it's not the pushback against the bicycle lane. It's the pushback against the fact that you're not hearing them. You're not listening to them. Or it's the pushback against the idea that you've erased them from the future. How do I know this to be the case? Because too often these before and after renderings don't include people of color. And so what we find is that transportation has been weaponized as a tool of oppression within our society. And all we have to do is look to the highway robbery that has taken place all over North America, whether the historic Treme in New Orleans or many of the streets and roads that exist in New York City, Connecticut, elsewhere throughout New York, as well as New Jersey. and even in the nation's capital. We also know then that there's a connection to transportation in the climate justice movement. I was fortunate and unfortunate to have experienced Hurricane Katrina that hit Mississippi in 2005 and Hurricane Sandy that hit New Jersey in 2012. But it doesn't end at climate justice or the need for climate justice. There's also who's being hit and who's most at risk on our streets. And what we find is that it's older adults, people of color, and people walking in low-income communities. As it relates to older adults, what we saw back in 2012, I think is where this data is from, the relative pedestrian danger for older adults aged 50 and above was more than a third higher than the general population. During the same time, between 2008 and 2017, Black and African Americans were 72% more likely to have been struck and killed by drivers while walking. Lastly, people living in neighborhoods where the median household income is $36,000 or less were killed at much higher rates than their counterparts. But guess what the response was? It's all behavior. It's about the choices they make or we make. It's what engineers, planners, and others around this country stated as a collective response. It's behavior, but it's not behavior. See, what we know is that race determines place, and place determines health. And to illustrate this point, I take you to Peoria, Illinois, where in Peoria, when you look at blue here, blue represents where most of the whites live, green represents where most of the Blacks live, purple, Hispanic, and the other colors represents my Asian brothers and sisters. What you find due to what is seen here by the makeup of these tracks is that someone who lives in a white neighborhood in Peoria, Illinois, will almost never go to a Black neighborhood. And a lot of people in Black neighborhoods won't get the opportunity to go to an affluent white neighborhood. But it doesn't just happen there. It also happens in Detroit. And if you're looking at this map, and blue represents where white people live, green, Black, purple, Hispanic, Asian are the peach and pink colors, what do you see? Well, what you see is a pattern that is true all over America, because now we go to Houston, Texas, one of the largest metropolitan areas in all of America. And what you see there is what you saw in Peoria, as well as what you see in Detroit. But we won't just pick on those places. Let's move to Atlanta as well. And what you see in Atlanta is also what you see there. What you're starting to see is racial residential segregation. But it's not just racial residential segregation. If you look closer, what you start to see, even in the nation's capital, is that it's driven by transportation infrastructure, roadways that serve as dividing lines. And I dare say, intentionally. So that's then bring it home. What you see then, even here in one of the nation's most progressive cities, at least on paper, is that there still exists racial residential segregation. And so people usually ask, is there an exception to this rule? Absolutely, go to Portland. And I usually laugh here because Portland is one of my favorite cities in all of America. But if white is representing by blue in this map, and green represents Blacks on this map, purple represents Hispanics, peach and pink represents Asian, what do you see in Portland? You see a system that has denied access to people of color or racialized minorities in this country. But what's present in Portland is present elsewhere. So what we find then is that history doesn't say goodbye. History says, see you later. And what is the later? The data that I share with you is from 2008 to 2017. The most recent data says what? Nothing has changed. Well, there's an exception to that rule. It used to be that the burden was not shared equally. And we could point to the fact that Hispanic, Latino populations, Blacks, and Native Americans were experiencing a disproportionate share of the fatalities. Well, the latest data shows that it's no longer the Hispanic population, but it remains the Black and Native Americans. So think then too about the danger of using the aggregate phrase minorities. Whose behavior are you normalizing? and who's benefiting from you doing so. So the question becomes, how can we create a safe, equitable, and inclusive system for all? Well, it starts with the realization that surrounding New York, because New York as a state is not in the top 25, but in the tri-state area, we do find that New Jersey is the 21st most dangerous state for pedestrians. In Connecticut, it's the 23rd most dangerous state for pedestrians. So in order to make this change, what we have to do is address these sentiments that is behavior. Why must we do so? Well, because we have a history and a legacy of stating this is all due to risky behavior. For instance, if you have low physical activity, smoking, poor nutrition, alcohol and other drug abuse, it leads to disease and injury and ultimately to mortality. That is true, but that's not the whole story. See, if race determines place and place determines health, what determined race? What we find is that when we look at the whole picture, we need to move further upstream to understand what the root causes are. Because the root cause tells us that social inequities and their bidirectional relationship with institutional inequities create the living conditions that influence the risk behaviors that lead to disease and injury and ultimately mortality. So when racialized minority groups tell you the behavior, the infrastructure made me do it, believe them. See, what we need is a justice framework. We need a different way of looking at how things happen or came to be. And we need a framework that centers distributive justice, procedural justice, interactional justice, representational justice, and lastly, care. We could all use more care. But what does distributive justice ask of us? It asks us, or it forces us to ask the question, who has physical access to the street, to the park, or the trail? Because my research has shown me most respondents do not feel that children are safe from traffic when bicycling in their neighborhoods. Now, consider that within the context of safe routes to school initiatives around this country. I want you to know that as a Black son to a Black mother, no matter what program you have, if you can't convince my mother that it was safe for me to bicycle to school, then guess what? I wasn't doing so. So what are these environments telling parents like mine? Well, they're telling them for the most part, it is not safe. And the reality is for people like me, it isn't. Which takes us to also the fact that there are many parks and open spaces of whom we appear to have a lot of access to or proximity to. Because my research has shown that nearly 1 in 4 feel that they can safely bike to local parks or trails from their homes. What this signals is that proximity is not access. There's a social political environment that is not part of our calculation or our analysis as it relates to access and safety, particularly for people of color, which leads us to procedural justice. Who has influence over the design, the operations, and the programming of these spaces? Because we know that minority youth are not included in planning and transportation decision-making processes to the extent that they deserve. And the unfortunate outcome of that is they are more likely to be victims of traffic violence, which leads us to interactional justice. What makes people feel welcome or unwanted in a particular space? We find, and the research shows, that African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. So even when you build it, you complete that street, you open that street, you make that street safe and calm, we're still treated in ways that lead to our likelihood of being killed by law enforcement 2.5 times that than our counterparts. And there are intersectional components to this as well, specifically as it relates to gender. Male reporters being stopped at a rate 7 times that of females, many of whom are Black males, which takes us to the fact that no matter what conference you go to, unfortunately, the fatal violence against transgender and gender nonconforming community goes unreported or misreported in transportation and mobility discussions. It's as if they don't exist. Why is that? Why are we not seeing people which takes us to representational justice. Do people feel their experience and their history is represented in the space? Because we know throughout this country how often historical and cultural erasure takes place in communities across this country. They say if you build it, gentrification will come, and with gentrification comes cultural erasure, which takes us to care. How do people demonstrate their care for the space and the other people in it? Because many people are comfortable creating a space that is safe for all, but then mistreating portions of our population once they're there. And that begins with the fact that our systems have historically, as well as more recently, been biased against women and do not protect religious minority groups to the extent that they should. So how do we change it? Well, we need a new internal and external game plan, which starts with the fact that we need anti-racist values and an anti-racist culture. We need the adoption of racial equity action plan, racial equity trainings, racial equity performance measures, and then lastly, internal and external groups to hold us accountable. And notice the emphasis there, not just on equity, but on racial equity, because race is at the heart of this. And why am I bringing it up now? Because it's time that we build a racial equity culture within our cities, our institutions, and our movement. And an equity culture, if you're wondering, is one that is focused on proactively counteracting inequities inside and outside organizations. Why am I mentioning it to you? Because if Utah can do it, I know we can do it in the Northeast, just to start. I love you, Utah. So moving on then, this is all important because in the Vision Zero movement, there's a lot of talk about enforcement. There's a lot of talk about infrastructure investments. I'm here to make the case very plain. It's infrastructure investments over enforcement, end of discussion. No exception to that rule. Why? Because this thing gets deeper. You've heard me go on record saying that our mobility has been arrested. And you may ask that I expound on that. What is arrested mobility? Well, first, in addition to Vision Zero efforts, there are a number of a plethora of federal, state, and local initiatives, plans, programs, et cetera, all aimed at increasing the safety and the mobility and access of Black and brown populations across this country. But if we're honest about it, when you really look at the equity component, specifically how it's impacting positively or negatively certain groups, what you find is that few, if any, actually protect the lives of Black and brown populations. And when you look even deeper, what you find is that they're usually ahistorical or apolitical. In fact, you can't even mention the word politics in many of these discussions, yet it is politics that is controlling the distribution, the processes, and the procedures of that determine who receives infrastructure or who receives investments or who receives enforcement. We also know that few of these programs discuss discriminatory law enforcement. And when it comes to equity, there are no tangible organizational commitments, especially dollars, to working with and in the communities that are most impacted. Instead, most of the efforts are white-led, but Black targeted. We also find that the unconscious bias and the criminalization of Blackness and otherness isn't discussed as much as it should. Many of the people in this movement, unfortunately, came post-George Floyd. Is this just another thing to you, or are you serious? Is the question that you have to ask. Because when you check my record and the record of many, this was a problem way before the George Floyd murder. Then DEI programs are growing all over this country. But those organizations that are doing that internal work are not holding their counterparts accountable externally. And it's important that we do so. Because these are not, as they say in public health, social determinants of health. These are political determinants of health. And as a political determinant, we have to focus on the fact that Black and brown bodies when it comes to their mobility, it has been arrested. And what is meant by arrested mobility? Arrested mobility is this assertion by me that Black people and other minorities have been historically and presently denied by legal and illegal authority the inalienable right to move, to be moved, or to simply exist in public space. How do you achieve Vision Zero if our mobility has been arrested? Because this results in adverse social, political, economic, and health effects, as well as environmental effects that are widespread, preventable, and unfortunately, intergenerational. So what then is arrested mobility, you must ask? Well, here's the framework of arrested mobility. And you can see that it stems from the 4 realms of racism, which we'll call structural and systemic racism: personal, interpersonal, institutional, and cultural, which leads to policy, self-deputization, and law enforcement, which I'll discuss here, which then impacts our various travel modes, whether walking, biking, driving, taking public transit, using rideshare or a micromobility device, leading to these adverse outcomes as well as the mortalities. And if you've been following along in this presentation, what I've just done is taken you from downstream to upstream or upstream to downstream, depending on if you read from left to right. So then the question is, how are Black people over policed? Well, the first part of the assertion of arrested mobility is redefining or reconceptualizing what is meant by policing or over policing. And we do this through the lens of 3 to 4 Ps, the first 2 of which is policy and planning. That leads to that, for example, the racialized zoning practices that happen, but not just racialized zoning. We also find it happens through disinvestment. And so when you think about zoning, many people argue that zoning is one of the first tools of systemic racism. There's also enforcement, traditional forms of enforcement, whether we're talking state, county, or municipal or federal law enforcement. That's the second or third P. And then the last P, a very familiar image here for many of you, is polity, which is the self-deputization of non-Black citizens in America, of whom have had connection, control, and access to power to influence the policy and the planning and the policing that arrest our mobility. But you may ask, is there evidence to support arrested mobility across the different modes of transportation? Well, let's start with walking and running. In the case of arrested mobility, some of the most notable cases include Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, and Mike Brown. Ahmaud Arbery was doing what when he was killed? He was running. Trayvon Martin was doing what? He was walking. And Mike Brown was doing what? He was also walking. How was Trayvon and Ahmaud Arbery killed? By self-deputized non-Black citizens. How was Mike Brown killed? By law enforcement. But what does the data say? Because I believe that without data, all you have is an opinion. So let's stick to the data. What we know is that in the case of Jacksonville, 55% of tickets were issued to Black individuals, even though only 29% of the population identify as Black. We also know that Blacks were 3 times more likely to receive tickets than whites, and residents of the city's 3 poorest zip codes were about 6 times as likely to receive a pedestrian citation. And if you have not heard the name Raquel Nelson, do me a favor right now and Google her. But we're not just going to focus on walking and running. Remember, we asserted that it happens across all modes. So let's go to biking. And in biking, I've authored some of the, I feel, most groundbreaking research as it relates to enforcement, as it relates to access and barriers to biking in Black and brown communities, specifically in New Jersey, but also around the country. And what we find at biking in Tampa between 2003 and 2015, Tampa police issued over 10,000 bicycle tickets. 79% of them were issued to Blacks, even though they make up less than 30% of the population. When we go out west to Oakland, California, 60% of all bicycle stops included Black cyclists, even though they make up less than 30% of the population. Coming back to the Midwest, in Chicago, twice as many bicycle citations are written in majority Black neighborhoods than in majority white or Latino neighborhoods. In fact, in Chicago, what we find is that 321 bicycle tickets were issued in Austin, a low-income majority Black community, whereas only 321 to 5 were issued in Lincoln Park, a wealthy majority white community. But it doesn't just stop at biking. See, it also extends to driving, especially in the case of Philando Castile and the Queen Sandra Bland. What does the data say? Well, when it comes to a national report on driving, police report, what we found is that Blacks and Hispanic drivers are stopped disproportionately to white drivers. Unsurprisingly, police were less likely to pull over Black drivers after dusk when the race of the driver was less obvious to police. Then we find in Minnesota, which has been sort of epicenter of many of this, a state commission study in Minnesota found that Blacks and Latinos were 7 times more likely to be stopped by police officers in majority white neighborhoods. And then in 2016, 47% of the arrests by a local police department there were of Black individuals, even though the patrolled area is only about 7% Black. I hope you're noticing here that these slides, this presentation is not episodic. This is thematic. This happens all over the country. And so as we try to advance this Vision Zero movement across the country, know that these issues are present no matter where you're coming from on this call tonight, which takes us to public transit. And it gets at the case of Oscar Grant III, who was killed by law enforcement in Oakland, California. But what does the data say? Well, when we come to New York, while the number of turnstile arrests have decreased significantly, what has not changed is who gets arrested. 89% of those arrested are Black or Hispanic. The top 10 neighborhoods in New York with the highest number of arrests per subway swipe were all predominantly Black or Hispanic. And I hope when you're hearing this, you're not thinking it's because they're more criminal than others. If you haven't heard about Adrian Napier, do yourself a favor and Google him. Which takes us to Portland. In 2017, Blacks were 8 times more likely. Remember I showed you, there were only 3 Blacks in Portland, but they were 8 times more likely than whites to be charged for certain transit violations in Portland, Oregon. Thankfully, that policy was decriminalized. We need to decriminalize that elsewhere, but it doesn't stop there. It also goes into car share. And what we find when it comes to car share, ride sharing, Black travelers waited on average 20% longer than their white counterparts. And a scary finding is that female travelers were driven 5% further than males, given the same start and finish location. And if you are Black or brown, perhaps you've experienced this. And I've experienced this whether I was dressed in a suit or a Black hoodie. I've called for a cab and I've had my cab refused, or the passersby simply refused to provide service. But 55% of Blacks who've called for one at some point have experienced this refusal. But it doesn't stop there. It also happens whether we're in our homes asleep or playing in our yards, as in the case of Breonna Taylor and Tamir Rice. So then the question becomes, what are the adverse social, political, economic, and health outcomes of this arrested mobility? Well, we find that Blacks are less likely to be physically active than their counterparts. We also find that areas with larger Black population tend to have lower rates of upward mobility. See, the arrested mobility, the physical arresting of their mobility, has connections to the upward or the social mobility of Blacks. We also find that there's disproportionately associated with food deserts, made even worse by a lack of access to transportation options. And this last point goes back to the racial residential segregation that we saw. And you can see the point here is that it affects educational attainment for Blacks much more so than whites, which takes us to the fact that they have less access to reliable transportation, which means that they're finding they have less access to important resources and opportunities like healthcare, supermarkets, education, and jobs. And then it has political consequences, as transportation disadvantage makes Black people vulnerable to disenfranchisement efforts, like a lower density of polling places, which then exacerbates the lack of representation in government. Is that perhaps the reason why more Black people voted when they didn't have to go to the polls? I don't know. You tell me. So how do we then center equity to close this out? I'll give you examples of how to center racial equity, modal equity, procedural equity, language equity, gender equity, spatial equity, and my favorite one of all, common sense. Action number 1, commit to equity through the adoption of a racial equity action plan. If you are a city, an organization, an institution, or an advocacy group, you're not doing real equity work if you don't have yourself a racial equity action plan. Action number 2, prioritize investments and maintenance in minority and low-income communities. By investments, I'm talking about bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. And don't just build it, make sure you maintain it. Number 3, one of my favorite photos from the Bronx, ensure the full and fair participation of racialized minority groups. They have a right to be or to discuss the issues that are in their community, and you have an obligation to listen and then to prioritize what you're hearing. Action number 4, because we are a diverse populace, foster more equitable treatment of diverse languages in the public sphere. If you're not centering or prioritizing the importance of addressing language inequities, you're not doing real equity work. Number 5, documenting increased mobility and access for the elderly and persons with disabilities. And when it comes to these groups, they're not the same. And also when it comes to persons with disabilities, consider more than just physical disabilities, consider too cognitive disabilities and other disabilities as well. Action 6, engage with women in female-headed households, and by women, all whom identify as women, to deepen our understanding of their behavior and usage differences on our roadways. Action 7, because of our brothers and sisters who are foreign-born, let's engage with them too to deepen our understanding of their behavior and usage differences. Culture matters. Number 8, they said if you build it again, gentrification will come. You might as well evaluate and mitigate these so-called unintended consequences of improved mobility and access. But I'll make a modification in real time. If it happens over and over again, and you know it's going to happen over and over again, is it unintended? Action 9, following this statement. This is important because trees planted in minority communities mature just in time for gentrification to take place, which goes now to action 9, analyzing the impact of past and current zoning and land use decisions. As I stated earlier, many claim that racialized zoning and land use practices are one of the first tools of systemic and structural racism. Action 10, safeguard against discriminatory enforcement. The E in the Vision Zero movement must not be solely enforcement. Not to say that it has been, in many places it has not, but there still exists far too many places who want to lead with enforcement over infrastructure investments. Action 11, challenge and eliminate the scary Black male narrative. How can we move freely if they are afraid of us? And while you're at it, eliminate the angry Black female narrative as well. Action 12, collect and analyze disaggregated data on Black lives and experiences. Shame on all of us. We know the truth. Many of the surveys, the journal articles that are published by many of these institutions of higher learning have less than, let's just say less than needed number of representation from Black and brown people. But yet it's still, we go to these research findings, these programs, et cetera, that we deem as best practices, and we accept them knowing far too well that they have not engaged with and heard from enough Black and brown people. Why is that? Action 13, advocate for the penalization of race-based 911 calls, should I say more. Action 14, organize efforts to decriminalize jaywalking across the country. If you're looking for reasons why, please Google the work that was done by my friend Angie Smith and I, who we wrote an article about this in Bloomberg CityLab on 9 reasons to decriminalize jaywalking now. Quick point on that. The enforcement of jaywalking laws have a racial bias sort of origin. So along with one of whom is been sort of advocated by, sustained by the automobile lobbyists. Action 15, decriminalize bicycling. So we need you to organize efforts to decriminalize cycling in low-income and BIPOC communities. Action 16, speed reduction in BIPOC communities. These highways that many deem are roads and streets in many Black and brown communities, they are highways. Let's cut to the chase. Advocate for equitable and automated speed enforcement. And oh, by the way, when you're advocating for automated speed enforcement, let's also ensure that there's no racial bias in the automation of the speed enforcement, or the fact that there is spatial or distribution equity. Action 17. There's something to be said. I've worked in looking at traffic crashes all over the country. There are some towns, some cities, some places that have not had fatalities in more than a decade or a decade or more. There's something to be learned there, and I'm not sure someone has tapped into that. Action 18, Vision Zero, and many of these other programs are well-meaning programs. I stand in support of many of them, but too many of our best practices in planning come from Europe. Learn from other places around the globe. They do great work too. And maybe perhaps culturally, we can connect to it. Action 19, misaligned employees. Accept the fact that not everyone is suited for equity and justice work within your organization. It's perhaps time that you reprioritize or reassign some employees. It's time perhaps that you get rid of some of them. Because moving forward, this work requires people that can do equity and justice work. So perhaps you consider hiring new employees. And then lastly, how insulting is it that there are awards given out each year or in a biannual fashion around bicycle, pedestrian-friendly communities, strong towns, and that's no diss to my guy Chuck. Why are these awards given out when there exist Black and brown communities of whom are present in that community, but don't have access to the very infrastructure that you're giving people awards for? How disingenuous is that? How disrespectful is that? We must change that. And why must we change it? Because many of you are saying, Charles, we feel you. We're in the same boat. No, we're not. We're not in the same boat. We're in the same storm. And that is a huge difference between being in the same boat and being in the same storm. Because in my storm or in my boat, Black people are tired. They can't go jogging. They can't walk home from the corner store. They can't walk home with Skittles. They can't get a normal traffic ticket. They can't have a disabled vehicle. They can't run. They can't breathe. They can't live. Their mobility has been arrested, whether they're biking, walking, driving, taking public transit, using e-scooters, or disabled. And that exists whether the infrastructure is there or not. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor to speak to you tonight about safe streets for all, the importance of centering racial equity in the National Vision Zero movement. My name is Charles T. Brown. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Charles. We have quite a few questions in the Q&A. So I'll just run through them here. So Yeah, thank you so much. So the first question is, do you have an opinion about the federal infrastructure bill? And what role does the federal government have in fighting the wrongs of the past? And how can we do it while staying engaged with the communities that have been harmed?
I think the best answer to that lies in going to the communities of whom have been most harmed by federal, state, regional, and local decisions, asking them how they feel those institutions can best right the wrong. In a more general sense, I'm optimistic that this new bill, this new administration, along with the people that are present there, and I wrote about this, I wrote a piece on transportation and art and how I felt that given this time, this is the ideal time to get a lot of the equity and the racial equity work done at the federal level, because I believe that they have the personnel there that understands the importance of righting the wrongs of the past and have the skills and the expertise to get it done on various levels of government. So I'm optimistic that government will do something about it. It's just a matter of how soon.
Thank you. What communities around the world or in the States, do you think there are any communities that are building a good equity culture?
That's always a trick question. So what I do is I like to be fair. Let's just say no one gets an A. If we were, giving them a score, no one would get an A. But there are some people who are attempting to do some great work. I joke about Portland, but I think Portland is doing great work. I joke about New York City, but I think considering that New York City is a city that is organized chaos, I think they're doing great work. Chicago is doing great work. I would also go down south to a place like Tampa, Florida, who I work with on a non-discrimination and equity action plan. They're trying to reverse some of the past wrongs. I do think we have to be a lot more patient with these places while at the same time holding them accountable. But no one gets an A. I don't want anyone to walk away with this saying we have a model of success. I want them to walk away knowing that there's still a lot of work to be done. And that is optimistically said.
And then you mentioned maintenance, which is an ongoing problem. So, do you have any ideas on how we ensure that investments stay maintained and that the outreach isn't just a one and done situation, but that a conversation that continues?
Yeah, so I think if we are equitable in our approach, our processes, and ultimately our distribution of resources, the infrastructure or the need for infrastructure improvements will speak for itself. Unfortunately, we don't have a system in place that is equitable enough to determine where infrastructure investments are needed. I love the example coming out of Oakland, California, where they use real data, not emotions, not opinions, to determine where investments were needed. So if we were to let the data drive the decision, assuming there's no bias in the data, then what we'll see is the places that need these improvements will ultimately be prioritized first to get them. So the problem is in the people that we elect, the problem is in the staff that we hire, and then the problem is also in the processes that are guided by people who themselves don't value equity in the way that they should. And so it should never be a one and done project for anyone. All projects should be adequately assessed and maintained according to their need.
So this sort of follows that, and speaking of the ongoing collection of data, have any communities done a really good job at collecting that data and being open and honest about how they've harmed Black and Brown communities in the past and how they plan to address it? I guess that's a little bit
I think you can look to places like, again, Oakland, California, Berkeley, California, the work that was done in Jacksonville, the work that was done out of Chicago. There are many studies out there now that document the harm that was done. They just need more of you speaking loudly about the need to reverse that harm. I was on MSNBC with Al Sharpton, and I heard from a lot of people when I spoke about the need to center racial equity in this work. But what many people said was, thank you for being there. This was the first time that the national media they felt was really touching on the harm that was being done. So we need to hold accountable local and national media too, because these stories are not being told or talked about enough. And I think if we can bring them to the national media more often, perhaps a movement can be built that leads to more equitable outcomes for everyone, particularly people of color and low-income individuals.
Okay, I'm going to insert one question. I mean, you mentioned, you know, when you put trees and by the time they mature, the neighborhood is gentrified. So have you seen any city that's done a really good job of combining their transportation and housing policy so they can go to the community and say, yes, we're going to do all this, but simultaneously, you know, we will ensure that you will not be displaced?
No.
Okay.
If I have seen some who have stated such, when you go back over time, you haven't seen proof that it worked.
Okay. So do you see ways that the transportation community should be working more closely with the housing community? And do you know?
I think we're dying by so low, to be honest. I think the biggest problem is the fact that we're so siloed in our approaches. I remember HUD many years ago did a regional plan for sustainability in Northern New Jersey, which was all about bringing in the multiple sectors to, again, create a plan for sustainability for all. I think that's a model process, a process by which we get housing, transportation, environment, and others in the room to talk about what's best for the community. We know that these issues are very multifaceted, multi-layered, and to take a silo approach to it, it's to die by silo.
Yeah. So to a different, speaking of enforcement, because we recognize that arbitrary enforcement is not very positive, how do ring and other self-imposed forms of surveillance contribute to and perpetuate arrested mobility? And how do you address the rise in technology, including neighborhood chats as well as vigilance?
So anonymous, that's my favorite question thus far. Reason being is because I own a Ring camera, and I can tell you how often I'm getting alerts that there is suspicious activity in my suburban community. And I'm disheartened when I go and find that they're deeming suspicious behavior to be Black men who are simply walking by their front door. I think that it is contributing a lot to arrested mobility and these race-based 911 calls, because again, I walk in my community, and if someone has a Ring camera and I'm wearing my Black hoodie or my Black Jordans, they may think that I'm robbing the place. So I think it does a lot. And I thank you for making that key connection, because not enough people are talking about it.
Yeah, I will say the neighborhood chats in any community do not reflect the best on the local communities. It's pretty fascinating. It says, where can somebody wants to know where they can find the full list of actions from your presentation. Will that be available anywhere?
Yes, as we say in the Black barbershop, Clara, get at me. Just reach out to me.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions for how urban designers, landscape architects, and planners can shift the paradigm amongst our public and private clients?
Yes, Tom, I think it's important that you read more, you learn more about the ways in which racism exists in your profession. We all come from various professions, and I can tell you that racism is present within it. I think it's important too that, again, you look to examples other than just Europe for guidance, for inspiration in terms of design. And then lastly, I think it's important that you talk to people of whom feel they've been harmed by designed intentionally or not.
Thank you. And you mentioned that we focus too much on European best practices. Do you have some favorite non-European best practices?
Yeah, so I love what is happening in Mexico City, Mexico, where they're trying to reduce gender-based violence on public transport against women. I love the example out of, I think it's Bogota, Colombia, as it relates to the BRT. And I'm sure there are many, many others. I would even go to Open Streets in Bogota. I think that's a great example, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. And what is, you did mention the automated enforcement, because things do take time. What is your feeling about the role of automated enforcement in the interim or any other kinds of enforcement?
I'm a fan of unbiased automated enforcement. I think when it comes to automated enforcement, one of the key things is to ensure that every neighborhood gets a camera and that the cameras are not driven by these quote unquote high-speed roadways, because too many of those high-speed roadways exist in low-income and minority communities. And so that's basically like a double downing on the racist practices that led to those roads being there in the first place. So again, I find it disingenuous to over-enforce an area or a place of whom you've already burdened by the infrastructure that you're now going to over-police. So spread the cameras out across the city or town, because everyone speeds. So let's spread it out.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, New York City has been done pretty well at the enforcement next to the schools. I don't know if you've seen any data on the breakdown of who gets those tickets. I don't know if that's been public.
I could take a guess.
Okay. So I think that answers sort of the next question here. And some more questions here on, the automated enforcement and to equitable application of the from a technology standpoint. So I think, I don't know, do you believe in LiDAR? I don't know what LiDAR technology is.
Yes, I've heard of LiDAR technology. When it comes to the equitable application of the law, it's not, again, it's about the placement of cameras, but it's also about, or technology, but it's also about the placement of law enforcement too, like where we choose to patrol and whom we tend to target during that patrol process. So it's about revamping or reforming police departments to ensure, again, that they're not structured in a way that is encouraging the over-policing of Black, brown, and low-income communities as if they are criminal or solely criminal in their actions and behavior.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, this one, I not sure if you can talk, if a city has a Vision Zero policy, do you know how you hold the legislators accountable?
You make it public. So we should ask that all of these policies and their performance measures are public, meaning, and that the city has to report the degree to which they're meeting or not meeting their goals and their objectives. And then you write about, you speak about, you organize around how well they're doing or not. And you don't let up until someone is held accountable. But the lack of accountability, Polly, is a problem.
Okay, then this next question circles back to the earlier question about the trees and gentrification. Do you have any specific recommendations to what local activists can do? And are there certain, protections that we should be focused on?
As it relates to gentrification? Yeah, so I think it varies, and it varies depending on where you're at in the gentrification sort of phase. So if it is before gentrification, it's imperative that you do more coalition building. You start establishing community land trusts. You advocate for inclusionary zoning or limited equity co-op housing. And then I would say one of the strongest things you could do is start organizing and meeting around what would be included in community benefit agreements. So when developers come, you're not rushing to organize to do this, but you've been proactively learning from other communities of whom have been gentrified. And now you have a well-established outline for what you would like as a community. And then it's just a matter of fine tuning that once you see gentrification start to happen. If you're mid-stage in your gentrification, it's imperative that you look at like tax abatement policies. You want to protect against condominium conversions. Rehabilitation and preservation is important. So many of the properties that are being gentrified are dealing with the fact that they've been denied loans or access to loans and fundings to rehabilitate their property. And you want to strengthen rental protections. You don't want developers to take advantage of, well, I'm not totally against, marketplace things, but you want to strengthen rental protections. And then lastly, if you're late stage gentrification, what you want is more affordable housing trust funds. And you want to advocate that these new employers build employer assisted housing as well.
Do you have a community? I mean, that was an amazing laundry list of things that we should learn about and focus on. Is there a housing group for a community that you think has done a particularly good job? That would be a good resource for this?
I would have to look at the list, but I'm sure there are places in Brooklyn, perhaps, that have done so. I would probably go out west to the Seattles and the Oaklands, again, of the world, but look to places that have been gentrified and you can learn from their experiences.
Right.
DC would be an excellent example too. They've had some good work around, affordable housing policies and things of that nature.
Yeah, because usually in New York, the developers come in, they smell it out and they're there and it's already too late.
It's too late. You gotta organize now. Organize now.
I'm a little concerned about, the Bronx. Obviously, there's a lot of issues there that have to be watched.
Right. Go Yankees too.
Yes. And then I guess our final question here is on USDOT. Buttigieg is talking about electric EV today. Is he also addressing a national Vision Zero policy?
I don't know, but I'm glad that he is talking about electric vehicles. I'm also working with the World Resources Institute, WRI, around efforts to electrify school buses, the entire fleet of school buses around America. So if you're in a state, I ask that you advocate for the electrification of school buses. That too is an equity issue, as research shows that lower income students, of course, ride the buses at a higher rate than their counterparts. Rural populations, of course, ride the buses much longer than their city counterparts. And so this has impacts on people's health and well-being, the educational attainment. So for those who are in the Vision Zero movement, think too about the electrification of school buses.
Well, okay, then we got a late entry here. The intersection of transformative transportation policies and addressing arrested mobility.
That's a great question. So if you're talking about like removing highways that have sort of bisected communities and restitching or reconnecting those communities, that's one piece of it. That's the infrastructure side. Remember when I talked about redefining or reconceptualizing policing in the context of arrested mobility, it wasn't just infrastructure, it was also the self-deputization of spaces. So when you start reconnecting communities, one has to understand that there always exists a dominant culture. And in many of these places, whiteness is the dominant culture. So arrested mobility remains a concern unless you deal with the Karens that manifest as a result of the reconnecting of communities.
Okay. Thank you. So this has been amazing, and I so appreciate your time. I mean, for everybody who's on the call, the presentation, people can, go back through it. And then you recommend people are free to contact your office?
Get at me, yes. I just want to hear you say they can get at me, Janet. Janet, can you say that? They can just get at me?
Yes, you can say that.
Okay, all right.
So I'm sure I could speak for the TA community here in New York City that we're definitely going to take a lot of this to heart and integrate it. And it's very exciting. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to thank again Transportation Alternatives for having me. I want to thank you, Janet, for your hospitality, the great intro you did. And I lastly want to thank everyone here. Please stay in touch. I look forward to doing the work, not just talking about it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.